Hey. Hi everyone, welcome. Welcome to another webinar of the Governing Intimacies project. I'm Caio Araújo, a postdoctoral fellow here at Wits, at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research. I'm also a grantee and collaborator of the Governing Intimacies project. As many of you already know, because we see many of the same faces every week, alongside my colleague Srila Roy, who leads the project, I'm a co-curator of this webinar series called Intimate Archives. For those of you who have been following this series, you'll know that we have been really trying to create this conversation about gender, sexuality, and intimacy in and out of the archive. We also take quite an open interpretation of the archive concept itself, meaning not only the stuff from the past, but also a broader force field of struggle and representation is speaking to our aspirations and thinking in the present as well. So in this sense, the research that we do, the pieces that we write, they're also part of this archive and of this conversation and exchange that we are trying to create. Today, we are very glad to be welcome a great group of emerging scholars based here in South Africa at Wits and at the University of Pretoria. We are very happy to have all of them here, as their work is really a testimony to the vibrancy and the creativity we see in queer African studies. So welcome everyone, the attendees and the participants as well. I'll introduce each speaker as we go along. I just want to remind everyone in the audience that you are very welcome to write your questions or your comments in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will gather the questions and comments later. So we'll start with Noam Lubinski, who's completing his MA under the Governing Intimacies project on the history of synthetic testosterone use in South Africa. Noam, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Caio. I have to admit, when I looked at the actual title of this talk, I got really stuck at about every single word in it, from what is queer to what is Africa. But I couldn't quite get over the very first word of emerging, right? I think so much of what we do in the continent, however we want to define that, is less about emerging and more about unearthing. It's about recovering and remembering things that have been extracted and are still being extracted from the continent. I know with my work itself, as Caio said, focused on the temporal life of synthetic testosterone in South Africa at the dawn of democracy. It has its very own extractive nature. And it has its very own history of extraction. However, that's not something I'm going to have time to talk through today. Rather, what I'm going to try to speak about is what I've been calling my methodology of absence. In essence, what it means to look at something that doesn't necessarily want to be seen, and then what then happens, or should we actually try to see something that doesn't want to be seen, and looking through the archives in that way. And so I've been using an ethnographic, autoethnographic, and archival method throughout, along with, once again, what I've been calling this method of absence. So before I go into this, just a few disclaimers about myself and my work. First of all, I would like to say a huge thank you to my supervisors, Beatrice Minga and Shireen Ali, as well as a massive thank you to Shrila and the entire Governing Intimacies team, who, without them, I wouldn't be speaking to you today. I would also like to actually thank synthetic testosterone itself, or what I'm going to be calling T throughout the work, as without my interactions with it, I also don't know if I'd have gotten to this point. The next kind of thing I'd like to say is the work I do, I wouldn't define it as queer studies, I define it as trans studies. I think it's very important for us to be specific in the kinds of work we're doing and not always lump everything together. This is specifically important because a lot of the work I do isn't just trans studies, it's medicalized trans studies. It's looking at transness through a medical lens and looking primarily at people who want medically affirming treatment. What this means is that I'm already looking at a very small group of participants when it comes to the broader trans community. We can look in South African history at people like Gertie the lesbian, who was very often in the drama in the 1980s, as well as QP from District 6, both of whom today we may call trans, but neither of whom ever really said that they wanted, or ever connoted that they wanted any sort of medicalized affirmation. That brings me to my last disclaimer, and hopefully I'll get through all my disclaimers before actually starting, before running out of time. But I also want to be very careful in saying that the work I do is very specific to South Africa. And so I worry about calling it African studies. For example, because of multiple reasons that I won't have time to go into today, all of my interviewees are white and Afrikaner. This is obviously something that's extremely specific to the South African settler colonial context and to my own settler colonial context as a white person in South Africa. And I think needing to understand the ways in which coloniality has worked differently in South Africa to the rest of the continent is important. I therefore, while there are many others, if you're looking for people directly within governing intimacies that are working on the continent, I would recommend the work of Mercy Mapuvanda, as well as Efemia Chela, both of whom are doing things outside of South Africa. Great. So then on to the real stuff. So Sarah Ahmed says that the history of bodies can be rewritten as the history of what is reachable. This is what I'm very interested in my archival research. What can be reached? When and how has synthetic testosterone been reached by the trans community? This is very much in line with the roundtable on theorizing queer temporalities that happened in 2007 with Christopher Nealon, saying that what we're looking for when we look into the archive is a history of mutually isolated individuals dreaming similar dreams and who have been arrayed in the aftermath of collective struggles. And I believe that this is what we're all doing when we're looking into the archive. We're looking at, for some extent, for ourselves or for some struggle that we relate to. However, this gets complicated when we then speak about African archives. If you would like to go to the second session, I believe, of these talks to look back at Rahul Rao's talk on the beguiling king who had sex with men and how he is looking at the archive to re-member that king. He's going to say much better than my summary, but essentially what we have with a lot of archival research looking on the continent is this effort to prove queerness, right? This effort to find transness, this effort to find gender or sex, all of which don't map linguistically or culturally onto the kinds of people that we're trying to map them onto. What this means then is a lot of the work that does archival research in this way is anachronistic, nostalgic of a pre-colonial time, and very passive. It sees the archive as a singular thing that is the truth. What Rahul therefore does in his remembering is to care less about the truth, even though the truth is important, and rather look more at how people remember it. With my own research, with so many people who today may be considered trans, having to go into stealth or hiding through the apartheid regime's understanding of gender, we have this question of what then happens when the people who could remember, who could give us that story, do not want to? What happens when that story does not want to be told? This then leads me to Makaria's work, who says that often when we're speaking about African archives, we're speaking about an archive of disposability, an archive in which people are not actually admitted into official view, an archive whose presence and that's much of what we actually mean by an archive, right? Because it's never done by the people who we're interested in, but rather by their oppressors. And so then when we have these archives that are inherently oppressive, for example, my main archive of the South African Journal of Medicine, which was deeply white and deeply eugenicist, what does it then mean to rely on that? Is it then better to be visible or invisible? And so then this question of what do we want from an archive that is quote unquote bad leads me to the question of silences and absences. So the silences and absences from transmasculine people is in and of itself part of the story of synthetic testosterone, part of the story of the Bible. Um, the uh, also the whiteness of transness as we see it today is part of the story of the Bible. As Fanny Sosa puts it in her text, Biohack is Black, with a twist on Sojourner Truth, why God ain't I a woman? Fanny Sosa says, why is the cyborg white? Ain't I a superhuman? There's an encapsulation of the problem with the predominant narrative of biohacking and perhaps by extension transness, that it is primarily white, Western, and fixed in global capital. When we imagine the biohacker, and perhaps by extension the trans body, as white, we are robbing it of a broader, richer history outside the imperial West. The erasure of the Black trans experience, both in South Africa and globally, creates what Marcia Okoa has called a black hole, specifically a black hole outside of coloniality. It is within this black hole that the continuities between contemporary queer trans life worlds and colonial forms of governmentality that reverberate in the extended present exist. She in particular is looking, they in particular are looking at queer nightlife in South America and how specifically Black trans women find a space outside of colonial time in the nightlife. Through this understanding of time and space, in which events and existence are seen or are swallowed, the presumed absence of Blackness, both in the archive and interviews, is one which speaks directly to the institutional silencing of Blackness itself. It is therefore within silences, distortions, and erasures within the archive and interviews that another methodology exists, once again, this methodology of absence. As Sadia Hartman notes, it is often the silence itself that sharpens the hunger to fill the gaps of these stories. The black hole explains the missing archive and the dark collapsing of erased time, and what happens to both celebration and violence when they are erased. It is through the fabulation of the vial's journey and the awareness of the archive as an apparatus of the state that a methodology of absence allows for a space for what is unknown, what is unknowable, and what does not want to be known. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nom, for this amazing, so many questions I have written down for you later. But for now, let's move to the next speaker. Jonathan Boats is currently a PhD student here at Wits at the History Department. Jonathan, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here, to everyone involved. So yes, I'm Jonathan Boertes, currently doing my PhD studying the gay and lesbian organization of the Witwatersrand. Previous work I've done has looked at gay soldiers in the SADF for my honors and the creation of queer spaces in Hillbrow for my master's, which is what I'm predominantly going to be talking on today. So there are two aspects I'm really trying to look at here. Firstly, my master's and my findings from it, and the problems I encountered during my research, which is similar to Noam before me, going to be touching on archival work. And this over-reliance us as queer scholars tend to have on Gala. I'm kind of just trying to look into how that's a problem and how we can work around that. So my own research interests are on queer histories in South Africa, and specifically focusing in and around Johannesburg. So my master's work and this upcoming article I've got, The Pink Inner City, look at how queer spaces are created in Hillbrow and the queer people who create these spaces during apartheid. In my research, I look at how these spaces such as clubs, cruising locations, or even private residencies come into being in this time where queer people are obviously so heavily policed. In trying to do so, I try to understand how these spaces were maintained and how racial dynamics also took place between Black and white queer people in Hillbrow, specifically in the 1980s when there's a breakdown of the Group Areas Act. What I found in my research is that regardless of space, time, or place.
Sorry, Jonathan, sorry to interrupt. I think there is a sound in the background, maybe something rubbing against your microphone. It sounds like pages.
Sorry.
Okay, never. So yes, please go on.
So sorry about that. What I found during my research is that regardless of space, time, or place, queer people or gay people, lesbians, have been able to create spaces of safety for themselves. In my research, I find that this peaks in Hillbrow in the 70s and 80s, but also takes place in Soweto and other townships, maybe not as predominantly as Hillbrow, but they also become known as venues of safety for gay men. Prior to the 70s in the inner city, there were spaces used mostly by men for cruising. And has often been the case for women, public spaces don't exist to the same extent as what can be found for men. So women have often had to make use of their own private homes and residencies instead. But in the case of men, public parks and bathrooms were spaces where cruising took place. These had very obvious dangers attached to it, but it was also the easiest way for men to find other men looking for sex. During one interview, I had an informant who told me about a cruising experience he had where he suddenly found himself involved in a hijacking. And he felt very vulnerable because he believed he shouldn't have even been there in the first place. He thought the guy he was approaching was involved in the hijacking, but after the hijacker left with his car, the guy he was initially approaching returned to him and immediately just offered him a space to stay for the night. And they both went back there together, and because they were cruising, went back, stayed together, had sex, enjoyed their night. But what I really noted from this interview and others too, was that cruising, because of how public these spaces were also sites of danger in the city. Joburg's cruising spaces were often targets for gay bashing and police entrapment. As I briefly mentioned, women never had a culture of cruising in Joburg. Instead, when they were trying to publicly show that they were interested in other women, they would often use dress and style as signifiers that they were non-heteronormative. In doing so, there was this notion of a normalized gender role that appears to have developed. The Butch Femme divide, which itself can and should be problematized, appears through interviews and archival material. It appears it should have been a slight necessity, however, as one interviewee I spoke to recalls that she had to appear masculine just so that she could highlight that she was approachable for other women and that femme women should be able to approach her. However, there also became this problem of safety in the city for Butch women who had to be more conscious of their surroundings as they outwardly advertised their sexuality in spaces where heterosexual men were often deemed dangerous. So cruising continues throughout apartheid for the most part, and was generally the most common form of cross-racial encounters. But as we enter the 70s, there's a growth of clubs in Hillbrow, but these clubs are only catering towards a white and male gay clientele, and women normally continue meeting in private spaces. Hillbrow had become known at this time for bohemian reputation due to the increased urbanization of young white liberals. And this tolerance is formed by police who find it easier to monitor clubs as opposed to public parks and bathrooms. This, in essence, allows clubs to flourish in Hillbrow, and the area becomes identifiable as a gay neighborhood. And throughout the 70s, multiple gay clubs and bars open in the area and allow gay men to create their own space in Hillbrow. Prior to the 80s, these spaces for both men and women, public or private, were largely racially exclusive. Public toilets were the only place that broke this racial divide on a very frequent basis. And as Zaki Ahmed puts it, in highlighting how prolific this cross-racial sex was, he says, apartheid was destroyed in those toilets. By the end of the 1980s, however, the Group Areas Act begins to break down in the inner city. And this in turn sees Black queer people, again, largely men, but some women too, start to enter into the inner city and into these previously white-owned clubs. Hillbrow then becomes a crossroad of class and race. And whilst white flight eventually contributes in the decline of Hillbrow as a prominent queer space, for a period of time in the 1980s and early 1990s, queer Black people were able to contribute to the subculture and help define Hillbrow as a gay space for all races. Different people had different experiences during this time in the inner city, as the inner city became multiracial, with some claiming not to have even been aware of an increase in other racial groups. However, we see in Skyline, which was a major gay bar, that it became predominantly Black by the second half of the 1980s, with a 95% Black clientele. Sadly, however, white flight does lead to the eventual decline of a once prominent gay neighborhood, as white club owners abandoned their spaces to move further north in the city. And we see that today, Johannesburg doesn't really have a space or a neighborhood known for being gay or lesbian or queer. And instead we see clubs or bars dotted around the city that are while well known, tend to largely be accessible to only middle upper class people. What I can clearly, however, say is that Hillbrow from the 70s through to the 80s and early 90s was a vibrant space, and it was characterized by ever-changing transgressions. There was no homogeneous experience for queer people in Joburg. Race, class, and gender meant that each person had their own unique experience in the city, but they all contributed to help create and maintain an energetic space in which people could, for however briefly, just be themselves. So for most of my research, I was using the archival collection at Gala, with my only other primary research really coming from interviews with a few people who lived in or frequented Hillbrow between the 70s and 90s. Due to Gala being the most prominent and, as far as I'm aware, only archive which actively archives gay, lesbian, or any queer history, Gala has become a site used by many queer scholars of Southern Africa. What I've been trying to grapple with is how do we as queer scholars find histories from hidden voices. We know that in other archives and in other countries, there are obstacles for finding these hidden voices. Silencing and destroying of historical materials and documents has taken place. This is evident in other archives in the country where material on same-sex relations are limited and mostly found in court documents regarding cases of sodomy, or as Noam said, in medical archives, where it's also just cases of looking in from the outside. Gala being only created in 97, and the secrecy surrounding same-sex experiences resulted in a lack of archival material. Whilst Gala attempts to create and construct memory and gather material from donations, there's still a lack of material. What's currently being done really well at Gala is the programs which are helping to generate new archival work. However, I still have found that there's a lack of work on previously marginalized voices. These voices largely come from queer people who weren't activists prior to 94 and are often only accessed through interviews. The lack of archival material in physical forms beyond what has been donated to the collection, I see as being somewhat problematic. We we as queer researchers begin to all use the same material as one another, and we only have access to historical records and materials which have been donated, which means that voices of those who haven't donated or have been unable to donate have been lost and can only be accessed through interviews, which still limits how much we can find, because it's only a few generations of people who were able to interview. There are certain names we come across again and again, prominent and important figures who did help to mobilize and organize, but we lose sight of people from the everyday who, for whatever reason, have not been able to donate or contribute to Gala's archival collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for another very fascinating presentation. Again, I have so many notes. Thank you, really. So let's go to our third presenter, Zuzie Kuzwayo, who is a feminist scholar doing her PhD here at Wits, looking at the experiences of bisexual women in Johannesburg. Zuzie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Karo. Thank you so much to my fellow co-speakers as well. And I want to send a special shout out to my supervisor, Shrila, who's been very helpful in this PhD. So I want to keep this, because I'm at the writing stage of my PhD, so I'm still figuring things out, and there's a constant existential crisis that I'm confronting as I'm engaging with this work. I think as anybody writing a PhD would. I want to hearken the words of Noam, who was saying that, you know, when we came together as the three of us to discuss this work, we're not unearthing, we're only visibilizing the experiences of queer individuals that have been in this space. And particularly for me in this context, visibilizing the queer experiences of bisexual women. I was very intentional in my research in selecting bisexual women because for me, part of my scholarly work is about documenting the experiences of women in all their facets, from the workplace to their sexuality. But I must admit in this journey, and I'll discuss the limitations later, how bisexual men and their experiences is not included. It's very limited research has been done on this. So why this research? One, I'm gonna state up front that I myself am a bisexual individual. And I think anybody who is bisexual will testify to the fact that this sexual identity is one that is very much so like the vaccines, misinformed, a lot of stigma that is attached towards it. And I think also there is a lack of knowledge or limited knowledge that is produced on the sexual identity. Hence you get the biphobia, the misinformation, the stigma that occurs with it. If we're looking at the history of bisexuality globally, it has always been present. We can take it back from the Greeks and the ancient Romans, and particularly in the Southern African context, you will be, of course, seeing the works of Mark Ipprecht, who is here on the call, blessings, who has documented extensively how there has been same-sex engagements and same-sex sexualities that have existed on the continent. So this is not new when we're looking at queer studies, but particularly when we're looking at bisexual identity in South Africa, I wanted to be looking at not only that historical context, pre-colonial and colonial, but I wanted to looking at particularly in the apartheid state. I'm gonna kick off there from that stage. And what we find is that there are LGBTQI plus movements, the one that Jonathan has mentioned, GLOW, who are very much so present in fighting against, of course, the 1957 Immorality Act and of course, against apartheid and things like that. And bisexuality is a part of the movement, but it gets invisibilized as lesbian issues, gay issues come more to the forefront. Now, what I found interesting was that when I went to the Gala archives and I was investigating just work on bisexuality, you will find that there is a lot of stuff that's mentioned about bisexual individuals. There was a movement there, but it was very, very limited, very, very limited, and for multiple reasons. Again, the misinformation of bisexual identity. Historically, bisexuals in this country, they used to use a word that says stabane. Stabane was a word that initially came from people who were working in the mines, who were stealing and who were engaging in sodomy. it now has moved in towards to say stabane was a person who has the same sex organs, i.e. bisexual, or male and female sexual organs, bisexual. Now in our current context, stabane is meant to refer to a derogatory word for LGBT, or I like to say non-heterosexual individuals. That's the word that I like to use, non-heterosexual individuals. So you have this word that is being used in multiple ways. And then at the same time, you have this movement of LGBTQI, where bisexuality, again, it has some traction, but it doesn't. But it's also, there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of prejudice, and a lot of stigma. So for me, I was very interested in looking at the South African context of what bisexual, the history was in this country. And then also, more importantly for me, taking it from the global South. What does it mean when we are thinking about our sexual identities versus the ones that are being prescribed to us from the global north? And how do issues of race, class, and space, as Jonathan has mentioned, play a part in that? So in doing that, of course, I looked at bisexual literature. I looked at how bisexual erasure occurs by Yoshino, the multiple forms of bisexual erasure that occurs. And one of the things that I was asking my participants was, how do you define bisexual? How do you define bisexual identity? And I found from that I had multiple explanations and definitions of that. And so it became very clear to me that this identity, which people, one, have always thought of you're either like a male or a woman, or one that people will say, I'm just attracted to the individual regardless of the gender, or some will just say, I'm attracted to more than multiple genders. I found that all these definitions for me were hearkening towards a queer identity, hearkening again towards that fluid identity of understanding bisexual identity. And my participants revealed that. And what I found is that, like, when I asked them, like, okay, how would you define coming out, like the act of coming out, saying claiming your sexual identity in public? And do you think that it's necessary? Again, there were divergent perspectives on that, perspectives that ranged from some individuals who felt that it was necessary, it was a political act, to individuals who felt that, straight people don't have to come out, why should I? Others who were questioning the heteronormative binary understanding of coming out. But then others who were also looking at this idea of, well, this coming out is a very Western understanding of sexual identities and how we perform them. And so why am I engaging in this? And so I started looking at research again in the global South, and how from Uganda to Indonesia, you are finding that people, and particularly women, were always engaging in same-sex identity, having same-sex engagements, romantic relationships, let's just say that. And they didn't necessarily disclose their sexual identity in the traditional ways in which we are thinking about disclosing. But nonetheless, they still disclosed their sexual identity, whether it was in their behavior in public, whether it was just with a few people. And for me, that made me question again this Western understanding of coming out, that you must constantly be doing this act versus performing it and not necessarily having to constantly engage in the labor, and also disclosing in a different way as a form of activism, or just as a form as a global South way of understanding one claiming their sexual identity, because that's one of the ideas of coming out. So that made me think about how, context does matter. Also, the issues of race and class in this African context. We cannot deny the fact that there is violence that occurs to, particularly in this instance of my research, Black non-heterosexual women, and particularly Black lesbian women. And for bisexual individuals, you must remember, you can be with an individual who's representing as a man, and it can seem that you're in a heterosexual relationship, or you can be with an individual who's representing, as would seem, as a female in the same-sex relationship. So how does one negotiate? One faces the threat of violence if they appear in that same-sex relationship. And bisexuals are always trying to claim the identity and say, I'm a bisexual, I'm not a lesbian, I'm actually like a bisexual individual. And so what does that coming out mean? Should I be claiming that identity? But then issues of race and context come into consideration. Another issue that Jonathan hearkened to was spaces. I was very interested in looking at how and where these women engaged in spaces and where they hung out and things like that. And I actually want to call the title of this chapter, and I'm great my supervisor is here. I'm going to title it, Bitch, Stay Ready So You Don't Have to Get Ready. Negotiating Spaces in Johannesburg, the necessity of negotiating spaces in Johannesburg. Because what I found is that it was very interesting, predominantly my participants were Black women, and how for them, the threat of violence was very present here. Versus for the white woman, when I was interviewing them, the threat of violence, they can sort of think about it as like this sort of like exterior idea, but like they recognize it, they recognize their privilege. But when I was talking to some Black women, I was interviewing them, they'd be like, no, there are some safe spaces in Johannesburg. I'll hang out in Melville. I'll even go to parties in Braamfontein, and I'll hang out at you know, Pussy Party or Same-Sex Saturdays. But I'm constantly aware of space. I'm constantly aware of how I perform my sexual identity if I'm with a woman, if I'm going to have any public displays of affection. And it was just very interesting to see how these Black women then have to negotiate how they express their bisexual identity in public and how they negotiate that in certain contexts. What was interesting also is that all my participants were middle class. I did reach out to as much people as possible, but that was my sample. And I think that we all have this idea that class will be the buffer that somehow buffers you away from any forms of violence or harassment. And that was not the case with my participants, because they had experienced some form of violence, whether it was corrective rape, whether it was just harassment, or even like physical violence, getting into punches and getting beaten up, because of their sexual identity. And that really is saying something for me about the Black body, as Bakari Yusuf says, and even like Matebeni says, like how, particularly the Black female body, how it is constantly a space that is just a form of violence, and how anybody can in any way use that kind of body in that way. And that illustrates that for these individuals, regardless of class. There's no denying that the biphobia and the stigma that these bisexual individuals have experienced was difficult. There's one who says that like people call her a double adapter. There's one where they say like, you know, promiscuous, make a choice, you're being selfish. And there's always this underlying assumption of a lack of trust or promiscuity when it comes to bisexual individuals, versus recognizing just the fluidity of the sexual identity. Now, in regards to the visibility, I must say I am thinking through a lot, because there's this author, Michael Duplessis, who talks about, you know, looking at a bisexual identity when you want to visibilize a bisexual identity, because part of my project was like, nope, I'm gonna, you know, I need to be contributing to bisexuals. We're out here, you know, we're proud of who we are. The question that he asks is that, like, if you're going to be visibilizing a sexual identity, you're sort of demarcating what is bisexual and what is not. And do you want to be making those demarcations? And what is the impact of that? Specifically for a sexual identity that has constantly been claiming fluidity and constantly wanting to not be that. And I think that was evident with my participants, who gave me a range of definitions on what it means to be bisexual. So my question is like, you know, there was Bi Visibility Day, I think last week sometime. And I was thinking about like, why are we so intent on claiming this visibility, and claiming this visibility within a particular context and what that means, and still within those heteronormative binary understandings. I'm still thinking through that and what that actually means. And am I advocating for that? Am I not? I think in certain contexts, yes, in certain contexts, no. But that's just a thought for me that I'm sort of thinking through, of course. And again, I think I want to talk about the space, how it is that like Black women, as Jonathan has said, do not have the spaces. There's no permanent bars or clubs or social spaces for women in general, and how access to that also becomes very limited in terms of race and class. And how when you have like Pussy Party and Same-Sex Saturdays, those ones are in the city versus the beefcakes that are in the suburbs and the neighborhoods. So what Jonathan was talking about still persists, that there's no queer space and it's still affected by race and class. And then just lastly, I want to say that, as I mentioned earlier, one of my limitations that I found in this research was that bisexual men are not a topic. There's very limited research that has occurred on bisexual men. I'm very curious to understand why. I mean, I think I have my own reasons as to why, but that was a limitation because a lot of bisexual men came to me and wanted to be interviewed, and I had to say, so sorry, I can't, I'm doing this work. But it's interesting that lack of research on bisexual men was not there. And also just how, lastly, just thinking about bisexual identity and what it actually means. And I think I'm on that constant quest and journey to understand it. So yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another so rich presentation. I'm really looking forward to the debate. And then on that note, I want to introduce our discussant, who very graciously agreed to comment on the work that has been presented and on kickoff debate. So I'm going to invite Jabulili Mary-Jane Jace Mafuso, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the sociology department of the University of Pretoria, to join us. Jabulili, over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kao, and thank you everyone. Noam, Jonathan, Zuzie. I've really enjoyed listening to your presentations. I also had the opportunity to read your work, some of your work beforehand, which was really thrilling, I can say, reading your work. I think one of the things I do want to say quickly before I get into things is, as a queer person, myself, as a non-binary person, as a trans person, this kind of space is just really amazing to be able to interact with other queer folks, scholars, and hear their work and engage with it, and really just be excited by the kinds of things that I think are emerging in a different sense. I know, you said something earlier about maybe it was a bit difficult to think of, what was emerging, and a lot of the stuff that perhaps we do as African scholars, as specifically African scholars, Global South scholars. I know Sylvia Tamale speaks about what a decolonial project is, that on one hand, it's a kind of reconstruction, but it's also a deconstruction. And I've been thinking about those kinds of things. Deconstruction, obviously, kind of challenging and tearing down. And a lot of the times, I think people think that deconstruction is an inherently negative project, or tearing down is sometimes an inherently negative thing, when it doesn't need to be. But then also the reconstruction, kind of unearthing, but also rebuilding, not as in a return. I mean, part of it is we sometimes are stuck in a quest for a return to something, for obvious reasons. But I've also been thinking about the also being a newness, different voices entering in a space. And so just from that, I suppose I'll use that opportunity to very briefly, I've been asked to think about some of the stuff that I think, some of the research that I think is kind of emerging. Some of the things that we are discussing as scholars, as queer scholars, as African scholars. And for me, I've been thinking about, I suppose, the importance of this work, and I situate, our three presenters in this work. I definitely see why they've been put together in this webinar. I think all three presentations have spoken to emerging agendas, not in the sense of stories not having existed before, but in the sense of stories being heard, given the space to be heard. So that kind of emergence. And I've been thinking about this work as, how is a kind of this, queer work, African work and scholarship has a place in terms of how what do we want our liberation to be like, to look like. And that's how I've been thinking about it. And I think all of this work is vital because it helps us imagine that, to think through that. Who are we liberating? Who is included in that space? Thinking about spaces, who gets to be included in that space? Who gets to belong in whatever liberation projects we're forging? And I think queer work does that important work. And so in the past couple of years, I've seen scholarship that, not tries to speak against the narrative, but I think is important in that it speaks against, or it complicates us as queer people. It allows us to be complicated, whereas often there's a singular narrative that's very uncomplicated about queer folk. And so I see this work as complicating that, complicating us, allowing us to be complicated, showing us in all of our complexities and multiplicities. And so work, for example, that highlights joy, acknowledging, there's violence and danger, but also work that's been really trying to highlight joys. And I've enjoyed some of that work. And Noam, some of your work is that, in that kind of space. Read one of your articles on that, and that was really thrilling for me to experience it in that way. So yeah, some of the joys, but also work that speaks to, or gets us to think through, there's kind of been a very narrow understanding of patriarchal violence that I think feminisms have produced, really very narrow narrative on that. And so there's queer work that challenges what patriarchal violence looks like. Who is victimized by patriarchal violence often focuses on cisgendered women, cisgender heterosexual women as victims of patriarchal violence. And so there's lots of research and scholarship that's troubling that's getting us to think more broadly. And that's visibilizing different experiences, whose experiences get to count as oppressive and challenging that. Which I think is vital, if going back to the Liberation Project, but also to this notion of archives. If we think of feminism as almost as its own archival project, there's a real danger in whose stories we keep centering, but centering in a way that says these are the only legitimate stories, these are the only legitimate examples of queerness, or examples of violence, or examples of resistance, even resistance to patriarchy. These are the only examples, these are the only legitimate ones. And I think a lot of queer work troubles that mainstream, if I can put it, narrative that emerges in several feminisms in different ways. And then also there's also been, important to highlight, I've also been excited by work on trans folks in South Africa, South African work specifically on that. It's been great to see that work, even work that is unearthing, I suppose, troubled stories, unearthing violence. That work is also vitally important, alongside the joys, trans folks and queer folks more generally, access to healthcare. There's work that's coming out in that, and the kind of routine violences that don't get seen as violences or understood as violences that are perpetrated in healthcare spaces. How healthcare is conceived of with a particular subject in mind, for example, a particular gendered, sexual or sexed subject in mind, and all the kinds of violences that are perpetrated routinely in that space and through that space and based on that premise. And then also some of the work around identity meaning making, which I'm enjoying, and I think Zuzie's work is very important in that space, in terms of speaking about visibilities and invisibilities, and whose identities are visibilized, and also just meaning making, different meanings, how we make sense of our identities. And often we think about in terms of a decolonial imperative, is what meaning making do we have? How can we contribute to the broader, I suppose, tapestry of meanings and narratives? And I think there's a lot of work that contributes to that is broadening the scope of how we can understand ourselves, how we do understand ourselves, the different ways we have of understanding ourselves and understanding identities. Yeah, so I think all of this work has been really, really vital, the work that I've been speaking about generally, but also the work that all of you have done and are doing, and thinking about spaces and belonging, and both belonging in terms of an archival, but also geographic spaces, but also who belongs in the archive. What archives are we creating? Who's writing them? Who's allowed to write them? And who's allowed to experience, to engage with these archives? I think that is where I will leave it. I do have, am I allowed to pose a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
If you have specific
Okay.
questions, yes.
Yes. So kind of questions that I would really love to hear the speaker's thoughts on. Is around, we've been speaking about, you know, I suppose, spaces and belonging and visibility and invisibility and absences and silences. And my question to each of you is, what kinds of, I mean, and granted that this, each of our interactions with what is already out there is very subjective, but what kinds of work, if we had to be kind of creating a, I'm going to say a bucket list, though it's kind of a weird thing maybe, but a kind of bucket list of you know, of research, what kind of work would you want to see out there? Would you want to contribute to this archive, for each of you? What kind, whether it's work that you're wanting to, that you are excited about doing yourself soon or in the next chapter, or just work that you just think that would be really cool to have, or that would be really important to have, or yeah.
Thank you so much for another fascinating set of thoughts. You raised so many hugely important questions that I've written down for later. But for now, before we open the floor to debate from the audience, I will give the presenters a chance to respond if you want. You can respond to what Jabulili has said in general, or address the question, what kind of work do you want to see? So let's go back to the same order in which we presented.
Great. Thank you, Jabulile, and everyone for everything. It's always, as you said, so incredible to be in the space of queer thinkers. And so before I respond to that, I also just want to once again say a massive thank you to my supervisor, B. Kaminga, who is an incredible theorist, but also listening to you talk, listening to you speak, I also remembered how privileged I am to have a trans supervisor and how much that's been able to shape my work, to, you know, have that shared joy. Sure, so I'm going to try answer your question and Efemia's question in the chat at the same time, because then I get to journal on about my own work for a bit longer. So the other question is, with the current testosterone shortages, how do you think this will affect the journey of the violence in South Africa for trans men, or trans masculine folk in general? So I think in general, when we're speaking about the archive, specifically in the Global South, as you said quite beautifully, what we seem to always be struggling with is kind of the violence, and that violence is clear and it's apparent and it's important. But what I've been really privileged to be able to speak about, and I think this is due to my own personal privileges as well, you know, as a white sort of man in South Africa, is that there is a deep joy in queerness and in transness and in those experiences. And so what I'd love to see just coming out of research is research that sees that joy, and in that seeing of joy allows agency to participants. I think there's a huge history in anthropology, ethnography, etc., of having people in the global north as the agents and having people in the global south as the subjects. And I think allowing us to be joyful is a big move towards acknowledging that agency. The reason I think that also relates to the other question is, so again, guided by B, a lot of the reason I chose my time frame is because while there was, in long and complicated ways, very good access to synthetic testosterone during apartheid, that really didn't exist at the dawn of democracy. And so that is a lacking, similar to the lacking that we may see today or in 2018 with the shortages. However, my recent article with B, and honestly, the thing that spurred me on during these shortages when I started thinking about synthetic testosterone, is the ways that this precarity and this kind of reliance on global commoditization of our genders and the raw material of synthetic testosterone almost allows that agency to come through more. That when the vial is invisible, perhaps we all work to make ourselves a bit more visible in that time. Sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, hi. Once more, thank you to everyone, presenters, governing Intimacies, everyone for everything and all the wonderful comments and questions coming through. Looking at what kind of works we want to see, it's an interesting question. I think what I'm trying to personally do is try and find voices of people who aren't in the archives, who aren't your big name queer activists. I mean, for me, we come across Simon Corey, Bev Ditsi, Mokafisa, all these names that constantly appear, but there were other people, one, involved in various organizations, but two, also who for various reasons couldn't join these organizations and whose voices have also been lost to history, who we can find largely only through interviews. So my research is, I'm trying to find those voices, trying to allow them to have their stories told. And in doing so, I think also just allowing people a chance to reclaim their own identities and almost, like Noam just said, find joy in who they are. Again, someone who I did interview was unable to, and still hasn't been able to come out because he lived this married life and he secretly has to live what he calls his gay life on the side. And I found there are many people like that who's, because of these secret lives they live, their voices get lost. They aren't able to put their histories in the archive, put their perspectives in the archive. And I think that's the kind of work I want to see, is the lives of the everyday who we don't hear about enough. Sorry, it's not a long answer, but yeah.
No, that's perfect. Zuzie, do you want to go now?
Thank you so much, Shablile, for your questions. I think Noam stole my answer to your question, where I also wanted to be seeing the joy of queer individuals. I think for me, doing this research and just dealing with the violence. I think for me, I wanted to see the joy, and I got to see it in some of my participants, but I think more that joy of what it means to be a non-heterosexual individual, more of that embracing of that. I also think for me, another thing that this project has made me do is really just moving away from the city and looking at spaces outside of the city or the big city, and how, you know, non-heterosexual individuals construct or identify themselves. What can we be learning from those experiences and putting them also in the archive? I really am interested in that. You know, it's from this project I've just thought about the individuals outside of just the city, and because the city is so romanticized as the space where one can be queer, even though there's challenges to that, as we all know. I think I'm interested in looking outside of the city and what that looks like, and particularly in the Southern African context, in the African context. There was a question that was asked by Effie about, let me just ask the question. She asked, how do you think the lack of bisexual representation in media, rest in peace, Lebo Mathosa, Brenda Fassie, in South Africa, has affected people's understandings of female bisexuality and visibility, i.e. gay men have less Susan Nathaniel on TV? And I think that invisibility of those two individuals was intentional. I think that if you look at the context in which they were coming up in, the idea of these women who were having any sort of sexual pleasure that did not center a man was very challenging. And I think Brenda really tried to challenge that, because Brenda was really adamant about she's going to love who she loves when she loves. But when she was even loving the woman that she did love, we were always deeming as if something was wrong with her. It was not all there, you know? And so I think that representation of a bisexual individual, of a gay, having a mental issue, that the sexuality is just a phase, perhaps they're just going to become a lesbian. I think that has contributed to the misinformation and the stigma towards this bisexual identity. I saw that B also had a question, I'll just quickly wrap up, about the language. I am also questioning language too. I think the L, the G, the B, the T, the Q, and the I think I'm not necessarily a fan of in our context, hence I like to use the word non-heterosexual. I don't know where we move though, because even in this archive that Jabulile wants us to be thinking about, I mean, maybe it's my lack of imagination, but the reimagination is still very low on my part. And how do we think about these spaces? I guess maybe it comes with joy. I guess maybe it comes with how we choose to identify. But that language thing is also very something that I'm thinking about, and how it is in our context, we grapple with that. And for me, I always, in my work, try to center Black bodies and what that means for Black bodies, particularly when that body has already been invisibilized and viewed as less than. How do we then do that in the queer space? I'm not quite too sure, but I do question those. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I said in the beginning that this panel was very proactive. So our panelists were already responding to questions from the chat, which is great. But now perhaps Srila will pose another of the questions that haven't been answered yet. Srila?
Yeah, actually, if I can just go straight, can you all hear me? My headphones have been a bit scratchy. Okay, super. I'm saving my sort of congratulations and celebrations for the end, because I'm conscious of time and we have still quite a lot of things to go through. But just picking up on Zuzie's bit on race, I wondered if I could draw your attention to Peace's question about how these, is particularly posed to Jonathan and Zuzie, but I think, you know, all of you might have some thoughts on it. On was it that in the cruising culture, certain, you know, racialized subjectivities, bodies, however we might want to call it, were at the receiving end, or that race is co-constituted within these spaces and histories? And I think that's quite an interesting question, isn't it? Because it's not just saying, well, is it that, you know, Black women are more vulnerable, or that there's something about how these spaces together produce and police gender, sexuality, and race. So that's one from Peace. I think B's question was also to everyone. So I don't know if anyone else wants to say something about language. And then there are a few questions to each of you, which you can see in the Q&A, but I'm just looking for the more generic ones. I think Maya Bharadwaj had one about queer Indian South Africans and anything about the specificity of that history, or the specificity, I suppose, of that demographic. So shall we just pause there, and then, yeah, then maybe you can speak to those, the individual questions that Effie asked as well. And of course, I have questions that I'm dying to ask. Not questions, just no questions. Anyway, okay, go for it. Maybe Zuzie and Jonathan on the race point, if you'd like. And Jabalile, just to say, please feel free to come in. I mean, it's, you know, it's a discussion for all of you, so don't hold back.
Okay, I'll go first. I think that, Peace, thank you so much for the question that you asked. I think that particularly when you're looking at it historically, I think that the space and race do co-constitute each other, and that you are finding, I mean, for me, when I was looking at the history of bisexual individuals in the space, I was finding that it was the fact that, yes, particularly for Black bisexual individuals, that yes, they were dealing with the lack of movement and the lack of space and what then happens with it, but then also their own Black bodies and how they negotiated their sexual identities and how they moved in those spaces. I found that there was one, like an old piece from Gala, of how this one person was saying that, you know, people may not necessarily recognize my sexual identity as being a bisexual, but I do have these relationships with people that are temporary, that do exist. And for me, it does validate my sexual identity. And so I think that kind of temporal space, I would argue, in some ways still exists for bisexual individuals in the new dispensation. I think that bisexual individuals have more agency to negotiate because of the different spaces, but because race still plays a very much a significant part in this African context, and class particularly. I think you're seeing individuals, I think Jabile mentioned it, like in the healthcare system, how it is that, you know, would I be claiming my sexual identity if I'm engaging with a nurse who assumes that I am in a heterosexual relationship, or I'm a heterosexual myself? Would I really be wanting to have that engagement or not? Do I want to be correcting her or not? And I still think that those issues persist in some ways with space and race being co-created, I think. Yeah, I'll say that much.
Okay, I'll jump in on this as well. So I think with this race trouble that Peace highlights here, obviously historically, Black or non-white people bodies had to be so conscious of how they moved around the city, not just in, say, for my research, Hillbrow, for example, but anywhere in the city. Firstly, because they were Black, and then secondly, because of their sexuality. I think cruising made it slightly easier because these were spaces that were generally within certain times open to a larger public. Beyond just white or Black, there were spaces where there was an interaction. So cruising existed in this cross-racial dynamic because of there being more ease to interact. And to then touch onto Afemia's question in the Q&A, I think this still continues in why we don't have this racially mixed gay neighborhood in Joburg. I mean, first, I don't think we even have a gay neighborhood in Joburg at all. I think it still comes down to an occasional club here and there, like Beefcakes, as Zuzie said earlier, and no space for bi or lesbian women. I think class has a lot to do with that. Class, obviously, with an entire legacy of apartheid, like in the way I'm seeing it, a large portion of a Black population is still excluded from the city. So And I think also the move of the Cape Town being seen as the gay center of the country. It's more likely to find, from what I'm guessing, a racially mixed gay neighborhood there as opposed to Joburg. Yeah, sorry, I hope I was able to touch on your questions.
If I could also just respond to Bee's question quickly, because I think in queer and trans studies in general, this question of language is always so important. And I think it's part of the answer here is that what we need is stories that allow us to be more complicated. As I said at the start, I'm already looking at a very small set of trans people, those who buy into the Western medicalized version of transness. Bee's own work highlights people who, for it to be trans means moving to South Africa and being allowed to wear a dress, and that's it. And so it's, I mean, on the most simplistic level, it's this problem of, you know, we need shorthands to talk about each other. I need a way to find myself in the history, and the word I have for that is trans. But that doesn't mean that that's how much of that I'm projecting into the history is a very important part of this question of the archive. I think especially then when we speak about trans and in a way other queer identities, we also need to consider how much of our own understandings of these terms come from the pathologized, medicalized understanding of the terms that we get from the global north. And I've recently been reading Kaji Amin's work on Lily Albert, who just, I promise I'll take a very quick side note, but Lily Albert is the protagonist of The Danish Girl, you know, so seen as kind of one of these proto-trans figures. And very much in our understanding of this Western global North white figure, is seen as this prototype of, you know, what it looks like to be pre-transition, what it feels like to be trapped in the wrong body, which I think is terrible as a conceptualization, and then like the joy of post-transition. But going back to Lily's own reading of herself, is very similar to someone like Ikwekwe Emezi today, who sees multitudes within themselves, who sees gender as fluid, and in fact see the reason that she wanted surgery was to almost create more space for her feminine. And so even in these proto stories, even in the global North, these stories are never true. And so it's trans is the word I have, but it's also in so many ways the wrong word. So I don't actually know if that's an answer, but more of an acknowledgement of the problem.
Can I just quickly jump in there? I just thought that's really productive, because I think in a way that sort of maybe complicates your use of of the word unearthing, because to unearth means there's something there. And it's very striking to me how we're going back to the language of unearthing, because that was the kind of language which was before what would have, you know, been called the post-structuralist or the postmodernist turn, specifically in feminist or subaltern historiographies, right? It was the idea that we are going to unearth the voice of the subaltern. We're going to allow the subaltern to speak. And suddenly you had that whole, you know, POMO move, which basically said, what? Hang on. I mean, does that mean there is just one voice that's already there? Is there then one experience? And I think besides the, you know, the more kind of boring now debates about the post-structuralist stuff, the more interesting thing is the political implication, which is that there is that one voice. And I think the more queer theorizing and politics do to the feminist politics is always to start by saying there isn't something to honor, actually. So I'm quite struck and interested in how, you know, much of the language in this discussion seems to be taking us back to this idea that there is a foundation under our feet, and our job is to reveal, to visibilize that foundation. Whereas I feel like we're almost at that moment where, you know, that stuff is very kind of almost, you know, that's kind of past. So I'm interested in what moves us to now become reattached to that language, right? That's, I mean, one of the things I'm interested in. But I suppose similarly with Zuzie, I think, and actually the archive, and Erin has a question that I think links to that. So two things. One is visibility, right? So similarly, what is the goal of, what is the end point? You know, what do we keep making visible? And again, here, I think feminist politics is a good measure. So Sarah Bennett Weiser writes about popular feminism, and she says the goal of popular feminism is visibility, right? So you wear the t-shirt that says the future is female, and that's your politics, right? That's the end point, right? So the t-shirt. So what does it mean to say I want to make visible, right? I mean, what's the point of it, I suppose? And then I think very similarly with archive, and that's Erin's question, where Erin asks, what is the solution to the fact that we don't have, I suppose, enough archives, right? How does the secrecy around homosexuality that still persists in some communities affect archive creation? And I guess I'm wondering, what is the solution? Is it the proliferation of archives? Is it that now we must have archives of non-metropolitans? Now we must have archives of, do you see what I mean? Is it lack, and therefore is the solution abundance? If we think of people's work like Anjali Arondikar or Durga Mitra, is that what it is? Is that the terrain? Or is it that we're asking, what are the conditions that produce certain forms of visibility, certain forms of invisibility, certain archives? And do you see what I mean? I don't know. I mean, right? And how do our desires, and that's why I love Jabilia's questions, but what is your imagination? What do you want to see in the world, right? What is Zuzie's desire to make visible, right? Or what is Jonathan's desire to see the proliferation of the archive, or norms to unearth? And I suppose in a very small way, unless we sort of foreground our desires for what we would want to see, you know, queer worlds in the making, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's all we've got. Anyway, so that's quite a lot of things, and you don't have to answer it. I mean, obviously we're having a conversation, but feel free to answer I suppose more pressingly the questions around archive, and I think what Noam was responding to initially. Okay, just feel free to jump in.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think, like you asked a very important question, like what are we looking for? What is the end goal? Is it the proliferation, or how are things becoming invisible and constituting then what we look at? I think for me, we're not there yet. Like for me, I look at the experiences of Black women, you know, that forms a big part of my work. And I feel like for me, I'm at the stage where we need to be proliferating the space, and it needs to be not homogenous. It needs to be, because for me, once we start selecting, it becomes a criteria. And once a criteria starts to occur, who is then making the rules for this criteria? So, and for me, that makes me a bit nervous. So I would rather argue for a proliferation and a multiple proliferation. Like for me, like as I said, I want to be looking outside of the cities, joy, all that kind of stuff. And I think from there, that will begin to slowly, God willing, then begin to see what constitutes as knowledge that perhaps needs to be delved in deeper or needs to be archived in a particular space. But proliferation at the moment for me. Proliferation. Yeah, I'll say that.
I guess I can jump in as well. So I think I really enjoy Jabu's addition to my unearthing with the idea of rebuilding, in that I think we're in this very interesting place where decoloniality has lost so much meaning just by being overused. And I think that also speaks to, you know, this postmodern move of, well, maybe there isn't anything we should be trying to unearth. Maybe we cannot know the past. But the reason I used unearthing is to is because I've been quite inspired recently by Vic Munoz's decolonial practices of gardening, which is truly about going back to the soil and replanting literally like gem squashes, tatume, before they became colonized and became zucchinis, because the tatume is strong and survives, whereas the zucchini dies in your fridge in a week. And so I think it's something we all struggle with, right? When we're going to the past, how much can we hold to this past which we know has been problematized? And so I don't know. The archives we have are the archives we have. I think what's also been really inspiring me recently is ideas of living archives, is ideas of, regardless of the past, how do we then recreate these understandings and these identities by bringing forward what is there today? And maybe that still doesn't answer the question of, can the subaltern speak? I think all of us spoke about how we're still really speaking to affluent people, regardless of whether or not we're in the global south. There's a very specific respondent that we have that probably still isn't subaltern. So yeah, more of the living archive, even if we can't trust the old one.
I'll jump in there on the archives as well. I think a proliferation is needed, I think. But beyond that, I think there need to be a queer or gay archive or lesbian archive. I don't even know what to call it, because language is also just constantly shifting and changing. But I think it needs to be an archive that is visible and interacts with communities around the country, not just one located in a city. We need in small towns and townships. It can't just be, here's one in Joburg or here's one in Cape Town. We need at least interaction from an archive with people from all over, not just with people in cities. And I think that's what's important. It needs to become visible to show that queer identities exist and they shouldn't have to be silenced. I think that's important for what an archive should do, at least.
Absolutely, thank you. Jabulili, I'm not sure if you want to do kind of closing remarks, if you have anything else you want to say before we conclude this session.
I don't.
Okay.
Just to say that it's been really, I'm really glad of the opportunity that I've gotten to read your work and then also to sit here and listen to you speak. So it's been lovely.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming, and thank all presentations and the panel. This has been such rich discussion. And I just wanted to make a tiny comment on what Srila was saying, in the sense of how do we then rethink the notion of the archive. And something that has been very interesting to me, and also because this is a webinar on African studies, is to see how different kind of intellectual projects, they evolve in different area studies. So I would really encourage everyone to read the stuff coming out from queer South Asian studies, because I think there will be so much conversation and so much exchange to be had. Especially, works like Anjali Arundekar that Srila mentioned, and others. New conceptualizations of the archive. And I think, a kind of cross-fertilization in the Global South would be very necessary. And well, to conclude, I just wanted to go back to Jabulili's point, because I said that you raised so many fascinating questions. For instance, whose histories we keep centering, whose experiences we get to count as oppressed, even if we go back to the Liberation Project. And I think those are such central questions for all of us. And perhaps you're just giving someone their PhD project. It would be really nice if there would be someone addressing those questions. But I'm raising this because then our next webinar will be precisely on archives of liberation. So in 2 weeks' times. So if you are interested in these questions, join us again in 2 weeks on October 13. We'll have presenters speaking about this archive of liberation, especially coming out of Mozambique. So again, I want to thank everyone, participants, attendees, everyone that keeps joining us every week. And thank you so much.